You're listening to the Moneyweb SAFM Market Update Podcast.
And we're taking a look at the impact of certain regulatory adjustments in the form of tax directives that have come out of the South African Revenue Services, especially where it relates to expats that are filing a documentation related to their retirements. I'm joined on the line by Shuanita, who is the retirement and pension fund specialist at Tax Consulting SA, to take a look at this and see if we can make sense of it. Shuanita, thanks so much for taking the time. Let's start with a bit of a background on the session of South African residency legislation, or the changes that have happened. I know it's been an ongoing change for a couple of years, from as far back as 2022, but there was a deadline for September 2024. Take us through what happened there and how we got to where we are today.
Evening, Jimmy. It's an absolute pleasure to be on Moneyweb. So there's a lot to touch on with regards to this subject. I think the main point we're looking at is the fact that expats are essentially affected with regards to this announcement. On the 8th of April, SARS essentially announced a new way of applying for tax directives. It's essentially where they've stated you have now in 2022 done your tax immigration by way of obtaining a tax clearance of immigration PIN. This PIN is no longer as such. So now they want you to reconfirm your non-resident status by obtaining the notice of non-tax residency letter. This notice is essentially what they are looking for under the cessation of tax residency tax directive. So for expats living abroad, the thing is SARS has implemented this, and they've essentially told us, that the new way of confirming your immigration is by going this route, and no other is confirmed.
Now, Shuanita, when we look at the announcement from the 8th and all the confirmations up to this point, there is a deadline or an implementation date of tomorrow, the 11th of April. What takes effect tomorrow, and what do taxpayers need to know about that?
Okay, so the way that a non-tax resident applies for tax directive, that is essentially going to change. So what they're doing is you making a submission on your actual, on your application under the early withdrawal, which means that you, which means that you are essentially stating to SARS that on the basis of your non-resident status, you want to liquidate or withdraw your annuity. That is essentially you stating to them, you want that annuity, you are now applying for a tax directive to get a tax refund on the amount that you've paid. That manual submission, that is essentially now changed, where you are now going to do it on your tax return. It is now a one process and not a two-step process.
So, Shuanita, is that limited to the retirement annuities, or is it just related to retirement products in general? How is that kind of separated or viewed from a SARS perspective in terms of what I'm now applying for? So I say to SARS, if I've had a retirement annuity and I might have had a provident fund or some other retirement products in place, does it affect all of those, or does it affect only specific ones?
Yeah, it affects all interests within South Africa. It affects all annuities within South African borders. You applying for that tax directive alone, that tax directive is your answer. I mean, the announcement itself is stating that the tax directive and how you do the tax directive, that is being changed. So it doesn't matter, if it's a retirement, a preservation, or a pension. The point of the fact is the tax directive intervention or application, that has changed.
And from a taxpayer perspective, what is the implication in the event that I don't listen to this conversation, or I don't keep an eye on these directives? Does that then mean that I potentially will not be able to access the refund? Does that limit accessing the funds themselves? What are some of the implications that taxpayers could be in for if they don't adhere to the new directive?
Yeah, so I think the first question that we ask is, how smart is SARS going to get? How, SARS is at a point where they are now implementing AI in their stringent approaches with declarations and applications. They are not only looking at this year's tax returns, they are looking at as far back as 10 years. I mean, there's a lot of tax debt collections. There's a lot of things that is uncertain with regards to what SARS can do to taxpayers. You, as somebody that has gone abroad, you are at risk. You are at risk of asking yourself, okay, but is my profile compliant? Am I following the regulations that have been brought out with SARS? Am I keeping up with it? The whole question around that, I mean, in the actual announcement, SARS has stated they're supporting documents with no indication of what that is. That raises a big concern.
If we don't have, or if we have some questions and some lack of clarity from a SARS perspective, as the taxpayers, as the expats and all of that, how do you then start to prepare for that? Is it a conversation to sit down with tax consultants like yourselves and say, these are the different scenarios we could be dealing with? Is it better to wait until SARS has the questions? Or is it one of those case-by-case things where if your expat journey looks a certain way, it might have different implications to someone else that went to a different country, for example?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is think ahead. If you're a taxpayer, you need to think ahead of SARS. I mean, SARS is already, they are thinking 2 steps ahead, so you need to be thinking 5 steps ahead. You, at your level, essentially going abroad, you need to look at the fact of what is SARS going to trigger on my profile? Do I then go to a practitioner and ask the guidance of them? Or do I, you take the risk. You take the risk and you apply for a tax directive under your tax return, but not knowing what SARS will flag. So my advice to anybody that has moved abroad is do a tax diagnostic review. Ask a practitioner or any advisor, say, listen, look at my tax returns, look at what I've declared, look at if there is anything you note that SARS may flag, because at the end of the day, the taxpayer is not always going to point out what SARS will look for. However, a practitioner, they will point that out.
Shuanita, before I let you go, I want to take a look at some of the other things. I know this is not really related to the retirement conversation per se, but we've now seen that there's been an expansion in terms of product sets, not really from a retirement perspective just yet, but we are seeing investors are now getting involved in things like crypto assets and all of that. And we've seen, as you mentioned, SARS is now using things like artificial intelligence and all of that. From a tax perspective, as a tax consultant and as a tax practitioner, are you foreseeing this kind of creating more problems for expats going forward to say perhaps Jimmy is living in South Africa at the moment, might leave South Africa 2 or 3 years from now, and with all these changes happening, there's a lot more to be aware of and a lot more to consider than there was before?
Exactly, yes. So there's a lot more to consider with regards to the legislations, the announcements. SARS they are becoming, like I said, 2 steps ahead of taxpayers. You, as a taxpayer, declaring such crypto assets and interest, and you've got liabilities, you've got, capital assets within South Africa. You've also got investments. You, as a taxpayer, want to protect that at all costs. So with that, SARS is going to say, well, I want to make sure that I get my tax. You want to make sure that you protect your interests within South Africa. So yes, SARS is becoming smarter, and yes, we should become afraid. We should be a little shooken. We should be asking ourselves, well, is our profile compliant? Are we following the regulations of SARS? Are we doing the correct thing? Because at the end of the day, we do not know.
We certainly don't know, but the team at SARS does know, and so do the tax practitioners as they find out the information. So if you have your tax queries and you have tax issues, speak to a tax specialist around them. The last thing you would want is for yourself or to find yourself in a situation where you are looking to move and you are unable to because of a tax affairs. We'll leave the conversation on that note. Thanks so much, Shuanita. That's Shuanita Devet, who is the retirement and pension fund specialist at Tax Consulting SA, joining us to take a look at the latest tax directive and how it impacts the expats' retirement refunds effective tomorrow.